Okay, we're good.
Okay. Okay, welcome back. We are here, Gavin and I are here to discuss chapters 7 and 8 from Dawkins's book, The Blind Watchmaker. And just before coming on, Gavin and I were chatting, and you may or may not be pleased to hear that we have just 2 weeks left of Dawkins. So today we'll talk about 7 and 8. Then next week, we will cover chapters 9 and 10. And then in week 7, which is October 12th through the 16th, we will discuss chapter 11. And that will conclude our discussion of Dawkins, which does mean that beginning week 8, which is October 19th, which is about 3 weeks away, really, we will start discussing the book by Richard Wrangham, which is The Goodness Paradox. And if you have not purchased it yet, especially if you're intending to get it used through Amazon, for example, I don't know. It makes sense to start, get a copy of that book sooner rather than later. Of course, you can also get it electronically. I just want to give you the heads up that we will begin discussing in 3 weeks. Plenty of time, but it's good to sort of try to stay ahead of these things. For this week, we will talk about from Dawkins, chapter 7, which he titles Constructive Evolution, partly in response to the sort of misunderstanding that natural selection only destroys or deconstructs or takes away in the form of death. But as a matter of fact, there's a very good case to be made for natural selection constructing traits, adaptations, for building things. And that's what we'll talk about in chapter 8, and then in chapter 7, then in chapter 8, which he titles Explosions and Spirals. Among other things, we'll talk about sexual selection, what's often referred to as runaway sexual selection, which is an example of a positive feedback loop. We'll talk about these feedback loops and talk a little bit more about coevolutionary arms races. These are some very sort of prominent concepts and ideas within the field of evolution and evolutionary biology. So we'll talk about this in chapter 8, and then we will pick up on in a week. We'll address some of the more prominent criticisms of evolution by natural selection, or at least they were presented as criticisms, as we discuss chapters 9 and 10. In the meantime, Gavin, you might just take a moment to comment on the various assignments that we've been receiving so far.
Yeah, so I mean, the discussion questions and reaction papers have been going really well. People are participating, responding to one another in ways that seem, thoughtful. In it, again, that's all we ask for, is that you're, trying to work through these questions with one another, not that you have the answers. And then also your discussion questions or your reaction papers seem or are very insightful and thoughtful about the reading material, which again, all we're asking for. So that's all going really well. The one question that I did get a lot this week, was people or students being confused about the part in the Blind Watchmaker, that I think it was chapter 5, where Dawkins says that our cells only use about 1% of our DNA, and a lot of people seemed a little confused by that, and I don't remember him spending too much time on it. So after seeing so many people ask questions about it, I was a little confused myself, because that 1% didn't quite seem right. So I was wondering if maybe Dawkins meant something else. And I know this book came out in the early 90s, late 80s?
Let's see. I think 86.
86.
I think that's right. Yeah.
So the information he had available at the time may have been
Yeah.
different, but I looked it up, and it's still about like 10% from what I could find. Um, Scientists are only sure about like 10% of our DNA being used to code for proteins in our bodies. So only about 10% of it, um, as far as we know now, is what uh, scientists and geneticists call functional DNA. So it's a little bit more than 1%, but it's still not very much, and a lot of it is not necessarily junk, but we don't know exactly what it's doing. So,
Gavin, did you go back and look in the chapter? Does he literally say 1%?
I did not go back and look, but almost every student question that talked about it said 1% explicitly. So,
And you think that was I'm just kind of curious now. So he said, what chapter was that in? That was in
chapter 5 somewhere.
Let's see. What did he refer to that as? Selfish DNA or junk DNA?
Junk DNA, yeah.
Let's just take a moment. See, we would be doing this if we actually had class in person. Anyways, so HIJ, dang it. It's not in the index. Let me see if he calls it selfish. See. Geez, I'm not finding it. Okay, 5. Let's see. So that's under the power in the archives, that chapter. And
Oh, I found it.
Where is it?
It is my copy. I think is a little bit different than yours because when you've been referencing page numbers before, it hasn't been matching up for me. But I want to say
Oh, okay.
2, 3, 4.
Oh, I see it.
Okay.
I got you. Yeah, he says, amazingly,
Yep.
about 1% of the genetic information in, for example, human cells seems to be actually used. Nobody knows what the other 99%, why the other 99% is there. Yeah, I don't know the actual. Yeah, so you said he looked it up and it said closer to 10%?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe I wonder whether 10% would be any less shocking than 1%. I don't know. I mean, most people are surprised to know that there is the vast majority of the DNA, of the genes, of the genes that comprise our genotypes, the vast majority of that genetic information is not expressed. It's not used. It's not decoded, to build something about our phenotype. And as Dawkins mentions here, I mean, we don't know. People are working on it, and this is a major area of research and a major sort of almost a field within evolutionary biology is trying to understand what this DNA is doing there. I mean, it's gone by various names: junk DNA, selfish DNA, parasitic DNA. It's genetic information that seems to be going along for the ride and is not otherwise doing anything that we recognize. Now, maybe we'll recognize that it's doing more than we think. I think it's very unlikely. I think 10% is about as high as I think. I mean, it seems to me that based on what we know and based on how much farther advanced the field has become since this book was written. I mean, we've got it from 1% to 10%. I don't see much more than 10% of our DNA being used to being expressed to code for various features of our phenotypes. So it does appear that most of it is not being used, and this is true in every species for which we have data. I mean, it varies somewhat across different species, but most of the DNA is not being expressed. It's junk or it's selfish. It's holding on because that's what DNA does. I mean, genes are interested. They are the genes that exist today exist because they were successful at getting transmitted to future generations.
Right.
The genes we've talked about, the 10% in humans that that are expressed, those genes are retained because they are, they have a role to play in building our brains, building our eyes, and so forth. But most of the genes, most of the DNA doesn't do anything that we know of, and may simply be parasitic on the DNA that does do something. So it's a very interesting phenomenon that is widely recognized, and I'm sure there's much more disagreement. There is disagreement, but it's it's nitpicky kind of stuff. So at any rate, the explanation may not be more than, why do we have parasitic DNA? We have parasitic DNA. We have junk DNA because it's successful at getting itself passed along,
Right.
As it hangs on, to the DNA that is expressed.
Yeah. And I think that's a good sort of way to explain sort of how genes work, or how natural selection works, is that the junk DNA doesn't have to do anything to make the bodies they live in more successful at making a living, as Dawkins refers to it. They just have to be in the right body with DNA that is successful. So
Right. Yeah, there's another term that's sometimes used. I was going to say cheating DNA. It's not quite cheating DNA, but it's basically genetic information. What we're talking about is genetic information that's enjoying a free ride, or maybe enjoying a free ride. It appears to be. It's not doing anything. It's not doing any work for being carried along. It may be that if it's not carried along, that there are negative consequences for the organism. I mean, sometimes when we think something is not doing anything, what it may be doing is coding for, turning on or off, other genes that are doing things. And it seems to me that a lot of what we've discovered in the past, 20 years or 30 years since Dawkins' book was published, is that much of this so-called selfish DNA or parasitic DNA is somehow involved, in the expression of the genes that do things. So in terms of turning it on or off, but at any rate, that's neither here nor there. A lot of the DNA does not appear to code for anything that we recognize as part of the organism's phenotype, and that includes ourselves.
right.
All right. Were there any other comments or questions that you saw frequently in discussion questions or in reaction?
That was the main one.
Okay, great. So, I wanted to mention also, so for this week, we're asking you, so this past week, we asked you to watch parts 1 and 2 of The Genius of Charles Darwin. All we can do is, encourage you as strongly as we can to watch those. The first part is called Life, Darwin, and Everything. The second part is called The Fifth Ape. And then the third part, which we're asking you to watch this week, is called God Strikes Back. We're hoping that you guys will watch these. It doesn't require a lot of time. It's 50 minutes for each one of these episodes. And actually less if you put it on like 1.25 speed. You'll have to get right in your head if you can listen to them talking a little faster. But it's really a wonderful overview of, who Charles Darwin was, what his theory was and what it wasn't, and some of the advances that have been made in the 150 years since his theory was published. The video for this week, God Strikes Back, deals with much of the controversy or apparent disagreements or real disagreements between science and religion, between evolutionary biology and special creationism. And I think it's a really interesting episode that I think, again, it's about being familiar with the field, with the ideas, with the concepts, and with some of the misunderstandings with the field and with some of the concepts. So we're asking you to watch that part 3, God Strikes Back, and then we're also asking you to watch part 2 of the PBS Evolution series, which is an excellent series. I believe we'll be assigning several other parts, so I can see that next week you'll pick up parts 3 and 4. But part 2 is called Great Transformations. It's really just a wonderful overview of evolution by natural selection, including discussions of sexual selection and extinction and major changes over evolutionary time, which the particular part today that we're asking you to watch this week includes, discusses these so-called great transformations. For example, from life in water to life on land, and what's involved in that sort of transformation, and how we understand that sort of transformation, and how we can account for it. So today then we will talk about first chapter 7, which is constructive evolution. So I mentioned at the opening today that one of the sort of misunderstandings of evolution by natural selection, Dawkins sort of alludes to at the end of chapter 6, and he says, in the next chapter, he says he's going to take up another apparent stumbling block or alleged stumbling block to evolution, and this is, as he says, the idea that natural selection can only destroy, never construct. Okay, and in fact, this chapter then will make the case that evolution by natural selection can be wonderfully constructive. That is, can build things, very complex things, very complex adaptations. Well, clearly we've talked a little bit about this in terms of building an eye, for example. But in this chapter in particular, right on the second page, and now I realize Gavin reminded me that we may have different versions of this book. It's all the same words, but they're published on slightly different pages, strangely. But at any rate, what he says here at the beginning of this chapter, he says, natural selection, it's true, natural selection may only subtract, but mutation can add. Okay? He says there are ways in which mutation and natural selection together can lead over the long span of geological time to a building up of complexity that has more in common with addition than with subtraction. And here he sort of red flags what he's about to talk about in this chapter. He says there are two main ways in which this buildup can happen. The first of those goes under the name of co-adapted genotypes, okay, which he'll talk about first. The second under the name of arms races, okay, which he'll talk about second. The two are superficially rather different from one another, but they are united under the heading of coevolution and genes as each other's environments. So first, the idea of co-adapted genotypes. So perhaps the most important point in this first section here, we're talking about constructive evolution and building, the extent to which natural selection adds to what is already there, okay, or builds into, an organism further design complexity. And he points out that from each gene's point of view, he says perhaps the most important part of its environment is all the other genes that it encounters. Okay, each gene is selected for its capacity to cooperate successfully with the population of other genes that it is likely to meet in bodies. What it means is that over time, organisms, I'm not reading this, I'm just talking, organisms are built by, thousands of genes, each one of which, okay, to a first approximation, is designed or has evolved to work in cooperation with a whole series of other genes. And so what you find is that in organisms that are herbivores, and I think he talks a little bit about this, you find genes that build teeth and jaws and associated musculature that allow the organism to grind vegetation. Okay, you also find genes in that same body that build a brain that includes adaptations that make the organism very sensitive to would-be predators, okay, namely carnivores. So this complex organism is made up of a whole series of co-adapted genes or genotypes, or what he sometimes calls gene complexes, okay, each one of which is designed to operate in cooperation with another set of gene complexes and thousands of other genes. And it's in this sense that about constructive evolution, the evolution of complex adaptations that are built, okay, by genes, each one of which is designed to operate successfully and cooperatively in that environment. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Gavin.
Not to that point specifically.
Okay.
So no, you can go ahead.
Well, so he goes on to say, okay, the long-lived gene, this is in the middle of my page 241, he says, the long-lived gene, okay, the potentially immortal gene, which is just information, okay, that's being passed on, as an evolutionary unit is not any particular physical structure, but the textual archival information that is copied on down the generations. This textual replicator has a distributed existence. It is widely distributed in space among different individuals and widely distributed in time over many generations. He says a successful gene will be one that does well in the environments provided by these other genes that it is likely to meet in a lot of different bodies. Doing well in such environments, he says, will turn out to be equivalent to collaborating with these other genes. It is most directly seen in the case of biochemical pathways. So he's leading us into, he's using the construction of biochemical pathways, which is one type of complexity, okay, as an example of constructive evolution. Okay, the building of a biochemical pathway, A1 to A2, A1 to B1 to C1, that pathway is going to be more likely to be constructed if you begin with A1. Alternatively, he says in his example, if A2 is more prominently represented, that gene is more prominently represented in the population, well then the pathway that evolves is more likely, this is just a pretend example, more likely to evolve from A2 to B2 to C2. It's the same basic biochemical pathway, but the particular features of the biochemical pathway will depend on, what genes are already there and what information is already being carried along. So just to sort of step back from the particular details, we're not interested in the students, in remembering which particular pathway he's talking about or what example letters he used. That's not the point. The point is that in this example, with the constructing of biochemical pathways, it's an example of constructive evolution. Okay, it's an example of the building of complexity. Okay, and therefore an example of evolution by natural selection adding to an organism rather than taking away. You're building something into the system. Does that help clear through some of the details?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, and just to put a point on it, after he gives this biochemical example, he says, obviously, this kind of argument is not limited to biochemistry. It's not something that's peculiar to biochemistry. Let's see. Oh, he makes another reference to so-called selfish DNA or parasitic DNA. And what he says is, in some animals, this is on 247 in my version, in some animals, a high proportion of the total number of genes is in fact never read. Actually, in most animals, we now know. These genes are either complete nonsense or they are outdated, quote, fossil genes. But at any rate, that's neither here nor there for the particular point that he's making. Let me just follow through here. Okay. Looking on to page 251, Dawkins says that a major step in evolution was taken when cells that had been produced by successive splittings stuck together instead of going off independently. Higher order structure could now emerge, just as it did on an incomparably smaller scale in the two-way branching computer biomorphs. Okay, again, We're talking about building complexity, building something into the system. Then he says, now for the first time, body size became a possibility. Okay, all of this is in the service of making the point that it is sensible to talk about constructive evolution, okay, as distinguished from the misunderstanding that natural selection only destroys, okay, by virtue of producing death. Okay, one of the consequences of evolution by natural selection is the building up of complexity. It's the building up of biochemical pathways, the building up of cells that join together to eventually produce many-celled, large-bodied animals. And then that leads him to note that many-celled bodies then, again, one of the cascading consequences of evolution by natural selection, constructive evolution, many-celled bodies make it possible for genes to manipulate the world using tools built on a scale that is orders of magnitude larger than the scale of single cells. Okay, and that gets us into organisms that are on the order of the size that we are, that humans are, that tigers are, that elephants are, that birds are, for that matter. Okay. Any other comments on constructive evolution as in the form of co-adapted genes or co-adapted, what is he literally calls them, co-adapted genotypes?
Yeah, I think co-adapted
Yes.
genotypes. Yeah, no, I think that's a pretty good summarization. Just that, just in the sense that we mean, it's constructive. Again, we're still saying that the mutations are the steps involved in building, and natural selection still weeds out the unsuccessful stuff. But because of this co-adaptive genotype thing, what we're talking about is that natural selection or evolution sort of as a whole is building on what's already there. It has to build within the parameters that are already set for it in any individual body, and then random mutations build within those parameters, and then the successful ones continue to build on top of themselves. But I mean, that's still by and large constructive. It's still over a span of time constructive. You're adding things, and over long periods of time you're adding pretty complex things, pretty complex adaptations that weren't there before, and is in that sense constructive. I don't know if that's helpful, but
no, I think it is, and I think what we're trying to do, Gavin, is to just talk about this using different words and come at it from different directions that might click for someone for whom it didn't click when they were reading Dawkins's words. And sometimes it's worth hearing us, sort of struggle with how best to explain this, so that students have another opportunity for it to sort of sink in. I just noticed on the last page of the chapter, as he's summarizing what he's talked about, let me just point this out. He says, we have seen two ways in which natural selection can be a constructive force. And I just want to point out what he says regarding co-adapted genotypes. One way, which we're just talking about, concerns cooperative relationships between genes within species. Our fundamental assumption must be that genes are selfish entities working for their own propagation in the gene pool of the species. But because the environment of a gene consists to such a salient degree of other genes also being selected in the same gene pool, genes will be favored if they are good at cooperating with other genes in the same gene pool. This is why large bodies of cells working coherently towards the same cooperative ends have evolved. This is why bodies exist, rather than separate replicators still battling it out in the primordial soup. So the fact that bodies exist are a downstream consequence of these co-adapted genotypes, the cooperative, the requirements for cooperative, for cooperation among these among selfish replicators that we call genes. Okay. So at this point then in the chapter, this is on my page about 252, he says this is where we come to the second major theme of the chapter, arms races. And he notes that, and he's previewing what he's going to be talking about, giving particular examples. He says there are arms races between predators and prey, parasites and hosts, even, though the point is a more subtle one and I shan't discuss it further, between males and females within one species. So here he says, arms races are run in evolutionary time rather than on the timescale of individual lifetimes. They consist of the improvements in one lineage's, let's say prey animals' equipment to survive, as a direct consequence of improvement in another, say predator's lineage's evolving equipment. There are arms races wherever individuals have enemies with their own capacity for evolutionary improvements. Okay, I regard arms races, he says, as of the utmost importance because it is largely arms races that have injected such, quote, progressiveness as there is in evolution. Dawkins is going to make the case, and it's a case that's been made before him and has continued to be, highlighted, is that much of what we consider the most extraordinary design, so-called design, the greatest extravagances, the peacock's tail and the remarkable, complexity and sort of fine-tunedness of the human eye, for example, are the products of evolutionary arms races run over evolutionary time. And if you think in terms of, or just take the predator-prey relationship, which he talks about at some length. I mean, cheetahs, you think about cheetahs and gazelles, cheetahs have evolved such remarkable equipment for killing, okay, because gazelles have evolved such remarkable equipment for avoiding being killed. And so you have this, what can only be described as an arms race being run over evolutionary time. As cheetahs get faster, okay, that puts a selection pressure on gazelles for getting faster still. Those gazelles, okay, that are just a little bit faster are more likely to survive and reproduce and pass on those very same, genes that build slightly faster running. What that means is that in the next generation, the cheetahs that are outrun by these now faster gazelles will starve to death, okay? But those that just happen to be a little bit faster still will be the ones that run down the gazelles. And so you have this, over evolutionary time, you have a ramping up of the equipment on each side of this arms race, with cheetahs getting better and better at running down and killing gazelles, and gazelles, again, not individual gazelles, but over evolutionary time, gazelles getting better and better at thwarting becoming the cheetah's dinner. So neither side is winning. They're both expending tremendous resources, okay, in order to simply stay in the same place, which is why this kind of selection has sometimes been referred to as a Red Queen effect. And I think Dawkins makes reference to the Red Queen effect, basically running as fast as you can just to stay in the same place. It's a reference to Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland,
yep,
where the Queen says, well, in this world, you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in the same place. Hence the reference to the Red Queen effect.
Right. No, I think that's a good point, and I think it is important to stress the generational time scale over which this happens, because it's not, if you zoom in too closely on an individual or even a generation, it's not really going to make as much sense, because if a gazelle is not fast enough to outrun a cheetah, it's out of the race. It's not going to be part of the lineage that continues to escalate its side of the arms race.
And in what sense would you say we're talking about constructive evolution?
So the way I've been thinking about sort of explaining how coevolutionary arms races are an example of constructive evolution, is basically that when you have a coevolutionary arms race, and let's just take the prey side, for example, you the predators have imposed such a narrow set of what I'll call success conditions or successful mutations on the gazelles, on the prey, such that, you know, at least in terms of, at least in terms of their predators, only a very narrow set of mutations are going to make them more successful or more likely to outrun the cheetahs. So in that sense, natural selection, or, the cheetahs are setting up such a narrow set of mutations that can be successful, and that over time, that those successful mutations, which include, running faster, or, outsmarting the predators, or however they're able to avoid being eaten, and are thus able to pass on their genes to the next generation, that in that sense, it is over time constructive. Sorry, this explanation is getting a little convoluted, but it's essentially because such a narrow range of possible adaptations are successful, that it only builds sort of in that narrow frame over generations, such that it gets, the prey gets progressively faster or progressively better at outsmarting or outrunning its predator.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I would. Yeah. No, I think that's a good way to think about it. And I think the key word in what you just said is that something is getting built, something is getting added to the organism. Okay. Adaptations for running faster, including musculature that is faster thwitch muscles for more speedy running, or new adaptations are built in cheetahs to predict, the sort of zigzagging of gazelles, or new adaptations that, predict, where the gazelle will land if it's running at 40 miles an hour and it takes a bounding leap, can the cheetah, then, skid off one way and then find itself right in the spot where the gazelle is likely to land. I mean, in other words, all of that machinery of mind and machinery of the body, okay, that's required for successfully tracking and killing, a gazelle is constructed. It's built into the mind and the body of the cheetah over evolutionary time. Why is it there now and it wasn't there before? Because gazelles themselves are parties to this coevolutionary arms race. I mean, that's why it's called coevolutionary arms race. They too are becoming swifter, more successful at avoiding being eaten, and again, that may include adaptations in both. It may include adaptations of the body, the musculature, okay, as well as adaptations in the brain, okay, psychological adaptations to, outmaneuver, a cheetah that's chasing it down. So that's the sense in which we're talking about constructive evolution. Something is being built, added to the system that wasn't there before.
I was actually just thinking another way to explain it that might be a little more simple is that, evolution cannot just be reductive or subtractive, or else you wouldn't have the escalation of adaptations that you see in these sorts of situations and in sexual selection, which we'll get into next chapter. But it wouldn't be possible if you couldn't add.
That's right. I mean, it's not clear to me, right, that it would be possible. That's right. I mean, it can't just be taking away. But that's not what it appears like. It's much more parsimonious to recognize that something is being added to the system. I mean, we know, of course, mutation, but then something in the form of complex apparent design is being added to the system on both sides, right? On the predator side and the prey side, or the host side and the parasite side, or on the male side and on the female side. Okay, so at one point towards the end of this chapter, he says, to summarize the message of this chapter, genes are selected not for their intrinsic qualities, but by virtue of their interactions with their environments. Okay, that's an important point. An especially important component of a gene's environment is other genes. The general reason why this is such an important component is that other genes also change as generations go by in evolution. This has two main kinds of consequences. First, and this gets at co-adapted gene complexes or co-adapted genotypes. First, it is meant that those genes are favored that have the property of, quote, cooperating with those other genes that they are likely to meet in the circumstances that favor cooperation. This is especially, although not exclusively true of genes within the same species, because genes within one species frequently share cells with one another. It has led to the evolution of large gangs of cooperating genes. Okay, that's arguably the definition of constructive evolution. It's led to the evolution of large gangs of cooperating genes and ultimately to the evolution of bodies themselves as the products of their cooperative enterprise. He says an individual body is a large vehicle or survival machine built by a gene cooperative for the preservation of copies of each member of that cooperative. They cooperate because they all stand to gain from the same outcome, the survival and reproduction of the communal body, and because they constitute an important part of the environment in which natural selection works on each other. Okay, second, and this is, I want to just see this through. Second, circumstances don't always favor cooperation. So he's looking at the flip side here. In their march down geological time, genes also encounter one another in circumstances that favor antagonism. This is especially, though not exclusively, true of genes in different species. Okay, the point about different species is that their genes don't mix, because members of different species can't mate with one another. When selected genes in one species provide the environment in which genes in another species are selected, the result is often an evolutionary arms race. Each new genetic improvement, okay, constructive evolution, on one side of the arms race, say predators, changes the environment for selection of genes on the other side of the arms race, prey. It is arms races of this kind that have been mainly responsible for the apparently progressive quality of evolution, for the evolution of ever improved running speed, flying skill, acuity of eyesight, keenness of hearing, and so on. These arms races don't go on forever, but stabilize when, for instance, further improvements become too economically costly to the individual animals concerned. I mean, as he noted in the chapter, cheetahs and gazelles both get faster and faster, but there's a point at which they simply cannot get any faster, and it's a bit of a stalemate or a truce of sorts. Not because they finally see eye to eye, but because they simply cannot invest anymore in the relevant musculature or, skeletal support structure. I mean, after all, they have other pressing concerns, like producing milk for offspring, or for that matter, producing offspring. And you can't do it all. All right. Anything else we want to say about constructive evolution?
No, I'm good.
All right, so let's shift over to chapter 8, which he titles Explosions and Spirals. And I want to do that by sort of reminding readers where he ends the chapter of constructive evolution. And what he says is, okay, so this is at the end of the chapter. He says, bodies evolve integrated and coherent purposefulness because genes are selected in the environment provided by other genes within the same species. Then he goes on to say, but because genes are also selected in the environment provided by other genes in different species, arms races develop. Okay, he's kind of summarizing part of what he was saying there. And arms races constitute the other great force propelling evolution in directions that we recognize as progressive, complex, quote, design. So he says, arms races have an inherently unstable runaway feel to them. They careen off into the future in a way that is, in one sense, pointless and futile. In another sense, progressive and endlessly fascinating to us, the observers. Then, leading into the next chapter, he says the next chapter takes up a particular, rather special case of explosive runaway evolution, the case that Darwin called sexual selection. So it's a particular case of runaway or explosive selection. Okay? And he begins the chapter by distinguishing positive feedback and negative feedback. Okay. And this is important in part because in order to understand sexual selection, you want to be able to understand positive feedback. So, and it's positive feedback that can lead to, I think he gives an example of explosions. So, in fact, that is the example I think he gives for explosions. But before he talks about positive feedback, I think he addresses negative feedback. Yeah, he does. He says positive feedback is best understood by comparison with its opposite, negative feedback. So negative feedback is sort of, I think a great example is one that he gives for your thermostat. Or a thermostat. So the thermostat detects the temperature, okay, let's just say in a house, and as the temperature goes up, let's say you have the air set to 72, and as the air in the home gets to say 73 or 74, that then causes the air conditioning unit to turn on, okay, to pump colder air into the home to bring the temperature down to the set level of 72. So as the temperature goes up in the room, that causes the engine to start, push the cold air in, bringing the temperature down, and once it reaches the set level of 72, well, then the engine goes off. So it's, you have room temperature up here, you've got the set level here, you've got the room temperature here. So as the room temperature gets closer, then things are shut down, okay? It's negative feedback, or negative feedback in the sense that information is coming in, it causes something to turn on, and then as the air increases, it causes the mechanism to turn off. Okay, if a thermostat operated by positive feedback, then as the room got warmer, okay, well, I guess I'd have to use a slightly different example, but yeah, it would cause the air conditioning unit to turn on, okay, and to continue to rev up basically. But then as the temperature in the room, actually, it wouldn't work, would it? It's just so weird to try to talk about negative feedback in the case of a positive feedback system. Go ahead.
I mean, you could say that as the house got colder, the air conditioner worked harder to continue to make it.
Yeah, that's the better way to do it. Yeah. So as the house got, yeah, exactly. So as it got colder, then that would cause the air conditioner to work harder yet. And then that, of course, would cause the room to get even colder. Okay. That would then cause, in a feedback loop, the engine to work harder still, and eventually it would just, freeze up.
Right. Yeah.
Because, yeah. Go ahead.
So negative feedback is regulating, whereas positive feedback is runaway, I think is a good way to help sort of remember it.
Perfect. Yeah. Negative feedback, yeah, is regulating or calming things down. Okay. Positive feedback is exacerbating things, making it more extreme in some sense.
Yeah. Yep.
And let's see, see if there's anything I want to say about his particular examples. And what we've done is just fumbled our way through the principles of positive and negative feedback. He gives a variety of different examples. The Watt-governed steam engine. He talks about in chemistry. The typical positive feedback process is an explosion, and we commonly use the word explosive as a description of any runaway process. Then he also says, but positive feedbacks don't only lead to runaway increases, they can lead to runaway decreases. Right?
Yes. Yep.
Where the room quickly got quiet when they to make the announcement. Then he goes on to say that this chapter is about positive feedbacks in evolution. This is on my page 283. He says there are some features of living organisms that look as though they are the end products of something like an positive feedback-driven runaway process of evolution. In a mild way, the arms races of the previous chapter are examples of this, but the really spectacular examples are to be found in organs of sexual advertisement, such as the peacock's train, the huge feathers on the peacock, the male of peafowl, which are not just huge, but they're symmetrical, they're colored. I mean, they have eye spots. I mean, it's all a grand sort of production in the service of attracting females. It has the metaphorical look of an explosion. Okay, and what Dawkins is pointing out is that it is by a process of positive feedback, okay, or runaway selection, that many traits intended for sexual advertisement are produced over evolutionary time.
And do we want to sort of try to explain now why that is? Like why explosions like that happen in terms of, male and female genes?
Well, what do you have in mind? Why don't you give it a shot? Let's talk through it.
So, I mean, I thought about just talking about how sexual selection can sometimes be in contrast with natural selection, survival ability, but just maybe quickly to give a preview.
Yeah.
What Dawkins is, the reason Dawkins is comparing sexual selection to positive feedback or sort of, runaway sorts of effects like this is because a lot of the time with adaptations for sexual selection, adaptations typically in males to attract females by being flashy, typically involve genes in the male for their flashy displays and genes in the female for preferring those flashy displays. And because, like, say a male inherits his father's like flashy tail, a male peacock, he's also going to inherit, although he won't express it, he'll also inherit his mother's gene for preferring flashier men. So if he has daughters, he'll pass that on to his daughters. So that's sort of how stuff like this can run away, is because you're not just passing on the gene for flashiness, you're passing on, carrying, and then passing on to your daughters genes for preferring those flashy phenotypes. And so it escalates very quickly, basically, because you're getting feedback from both ends, male and female.
Very clearly stated, Gavin. I think that's, I don't think I can improve on that. I think that's exactly why you see this so-called runaway selection. Because in some sense, in the context of males and females, both parties are contributing positively in the sense of the genes that build the tails and the genes that build the preferences for the tails are being passed along. And so in each generation, it's being ratcheted up, okay? So that the males that are most successful in this generation will have a slightly more flashy tails. The females will have the preferences for those slightly more flashy tails. And so the offspring in the next generation, okay, will have, so the males will have, will build those very tails. The females will have those preferences for those tails. And assuming there's just a little bit of mutation, okay, have to produce slightly larger tails or longer tails and more brilliant plumage, just ever so slightly. May well be the targets of selection, okay, by those females that have preferences that also coincide with those tails and prefer the slightly larger tails. And so very quickly, given that you have, again, these genes represented in hundreds of thousands of animals, okay, you can very quickly get this ratcheting up, this runaway, this positive feedback, okay, the result of which is the production of males, for example, that have extraordinary sexual signals, sexual traits, sexually selected traits, like the peacock's train or the There are many species of so-called birds of paradise have these extraordinarily long tails, even if they're not super brightly colored. There's one, I don't know if he talks about it in particular, called the scissor-tail flycatcher, which is a bird that has an extraordinarily, one of it has two extremely long tails, tail feathers, like 6 or 7 times the length of the rest of the tail feathers. But then, of course, you have the females, okay, that prefer those much longer tails. And so each offspring then contains the genes both of the male that build the male trait and that code for the female preferences for that trait, although only expressed in the relevant sex.
Right. Okay, so then do we want to talk about how sexual selection is sometimes in conflict with natural selection then? Because I think that's those tails, and I don't know if he talks about them at length in this chapter, but he does use a different bird with a long tail as an example.
Yes. Go for it.
And I can't remember what the name of the bird is, but it's a bird where the male has like a 3-inch tail, and Dawkins proposes that the 3-inch tail is more than likely shorter than what the females prefer, but still longer than what natural selection would most prefer or select for, or what would be most adaptive in the environment. And the reason he proposes for this is that, a balance has been struck between attracting females and surviving in the environment. And sexual selection, and this is sort of the reason that Darwin originally proposed sexual selection as a complementary explanation for physical traits in animals, and something that needed to be explained differently from natural selection, because it's not sexual traits or sexually selected traits are not always and usually aren't adaptive for the animal. They're usually maladaptive in terms of survival, but they are, in a sense, pretty to the females of that species. So they increase that individual's ability to leave offspring, and that's all it takes. That's all it takes for the traits to be passed down and sometimes built upon. But then natural selection keeps that in check. So one example he gives, or one sort of way that Dawkins explains it in this chapter, is the biologist who did the experiment where he artificially lengthened the tail of the bird by 1 or 2 inches. And those birds who had their tails artificially lengthened were extremely successful in attracting mates, and they left quite a few more offspring than those who had their tails artificially shortened, and still a little bit more than the males who had their tails not altered at all.
Right. And those very same males, did that researcher also show that those males actually survived, the ones that had the extended tails, they actually survived less well, did they not?
Dawkins said that unfortunately the scientist did not follow up to check with them, but he did sort of predict that they might very well be less well adapted to survive because of their lengthened tails.
Right. And in fact, there has been, since this book was published, a huge amount of work on this very issue, and a huge amount of work documenting, for example, that the peacocks with the most brilliant plumes, yes, they are more successful reproductively, so they are more likely to be selected as mates. They are more likely to sire offspring, but they're also more likely to be captured by predators. Okay, I mean, they also have more difficulty flying. These longer tails make flight more difficult. It makes escaping from would-be predators more difficult. So they are less likely to survive physically, but that's offset by the fact that they are also selected more frequently by females. And so you can't, as Gavin, as you just mentioned, there's a precarious balance that's been struck. So males will, the sexual advertisements of males will continue to become ever more attractive to the point where the selection against survival, okay, equals, okay, the selection in favor of reproduction. Okay, I mean, peacocks don't continue to, you don't see, there's a point at which it becomes debilitating. Well, there's a point at which it becomes fatal. I mean, if all of one's resources are put into building this tail and the male can't even move, you can imagine that that's going to have consequences. Okay, he can't eat. Okay, he can't escape from any predators, and so in all likelihood, he's going to be picked off before he even has the opportunity to enjoy the benefits of exquisite sexual attractiveness.
Right.
All right, so all of this is this sexual, the evolution of sexual traits, of sexual adaptations, sexual signals, occurs by virtue of what Dawkins is calling the positive feedback loop, right? But of course, only up to a point.
Yeah, and it's also another example of constructive evolution, which is why I think it goes well with the previous chapter, is because it's another example. It's a different type of arms race, the one he said he wasn't going to get into in chapter 7, but it's another example of evolution constructing something, again, within that narrow range of what natural selection is sort of allowing to be successful, building on something, and in this sense, in ways that are sometimes explosive or runaway.
Right. Yes. So, I mean, these are the key issues here. I mean, the big picture is it's a misunderstanding that natural selection is only destructive, that it only breaks things down, that it only operates by filtering out that which isn't successful. Okay, that is of course part of what it does, but as a consequence, we can see that there are ways in which evolution can also be constructive. It can produce, greater complexity over time. It can build, adaptations that didn't exist, okay, before. And again, by analogy, I mean, these are constructive consequences. This is constructive evolution. All of this is to suggest that, that natural selection does more than simply destroy or take away. And that's, of course, part of what it does. But again, as a consequence, natural selection can produce extraordinary complexity. And that's part of what we're seeing in the context of co-adapted genotypes and in the context of co-evolutionary arms races.
Yes.
That is the focus of this chapter. What is his reference to spirals? How did we... Because the chapter is called Explosions and Spirals.
Yeah, I also found that a little lacking, or maybe I just missed where exactly he...
I guess in the sense of, like spiraling upward. I mean, there's this, predator-prey, host-parasite, male-female, and it's an ever-growing, sort of tornado-like structure, that it's a ebbing and flowing, but it's a spiraling outward in some sense.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Or I was thinking maybe spiral was a good way to, a good use of imagery because it gives the impression of sort of staying in the same place even though you're going in circles.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's what he was going for.
I don't know. I actually just found, I don't know if it's the reference to spirals, but it's one of the references to spirals. He says, this is on, my page 308, 309. Let's see. let me just read it. He says, I suspect that a good place to look for analogies to explosive evolution of a sexual selection kind is in human cultural evolution. Again, choice by whim matters. Choice by whim matters, and such choice may be subject to the fashion, he says, or majority always wins effect. So then he says, once again, the warning with which I began this chapter should be heeded. Cultural evolution is not really evolution at all, if we are being fussy and purist about our use of words. But there may be enough in common between them to justify some comparison of principles. Okay, bear with me here. Then he says, in doing this, we must not make light of the differences. Let us get these matters out of the way before returning to the particular issue of explosive spirals. So I think he's using, this is his reference to, he's almost using it in the same breath, explosions and spirals, explosive spirals.
Okay.
But I don't know that he really, I just don't recall him using it in any particular example. So maybe we shouldn't belabor it and just, I kind of liked my way of thinking about it, which is, there's something, I mean, in some sense, the center point is the same, but you can get this spiraling, out of control. It's not really out of control, but this ever-increasing beauty to coincide with the ever-increasing preference for beauty, between males and females.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to think about it.
Or he didn't talk about predators, and he didn't talk about, actually, you can think about, it's exactly right. If you think about predators and prey, think about how we've talked about the cheetah and gazelle. I mean, you have this ever-increasing investment in musculature and in the brain circuitry that moves those muscles, greater complexity being built in, and yet nobody's winning. We're just going around in circles, going around in spirals, although the spirals themselves may be getting larger, to accommodate the complexity.
Right, yes.
That's pretty good, actually. I think that's helpful. I think I don't think, for our purposes, we want to belabor it any further than that, if that's okay with you.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm fine with that.
All right, so towards the end here, let's see. Let me just see. I have a question mark here, but I want to, this very last paragraph in Explosions and Spirals. He says, the positive feedbacks here, let me just have something in common with those of sexual selection, according to the Fisher-Land theory, but there are differences too. Peahens that prefer long-tailed peacocks are favored solely because other females have the same preference. The males' qualities themselves are arbitrary and irrelevant. That's questionable. But at any rate, in this respect, the record enthusiast, he's talking about getting records to the top 40 status, and then people start buying them because they're top 40 status, or top 20. In this respect, the record enthusiast who wants a particular record just because it's in the top 20 is behaving just like a peahen. But the precise mechanisms by which the positive feedback work in the two cases are different. And this, I suppose, brings us back to where we began this chapter with a warning that analogies should be taken only so far and no farther. Okay, so he's sort of just, what we will see is that he's letting go of this chapter doesn't, is not a prelude to the next chapter in any sense. In the next chapter, what he's going to do is he's going to tackle a theory that a very well-known biologist called Stephen Jay Gould put forward called punctuated equilibrium. And he offered this as an alternative to Darwin's gradualistic theory of evolution by natural selection. What Dawkins, and actually what the field generally now recognizes, is that Gould's alternative was really not an alternative. It was just a different way of talking about the very theory that Darwin himself presented. Darwin focused on gradualism and on, ratcheting of, up of tiny changes over time. Gould wants to argue that some changes look more punctuated. They look more extraordinary, as if gradualism wasn't, the way in which these changes came about. But it's all a matter of how closely you dial in to look at what's happening. And if you step way back, looking over, hundreds of millions of years at a time, it might appear that suddenly the dinosaurs come into existence, and suddenly they're extinct, and suddenly mammals, and so forth. And so you might argue, you see, it's not gradualistic, it's punctuated. But that's only if you step back so far. I mean, if you look at what's going on at the level of, individual dinosaurs, living and dying, individual mammals living and dying, it's gradualism all the way down. And that's sort of the prelude for this chapter 9, which is, the title of which is Puncturing Punctuationism. He's basically going to argue against anything new or novel in Stephen Jay Gould's theories, which at the time were very, very, no, I don't even know. I was going to say at the time, they're still talked about. I mean, Stephen Jay Gould has since died, but he was a wonderful writer, and he was, he captivated, millions of Americans in particular with his theory, with his alternative way of thinking about evolution by natural selection. And, there were some, and it wasn't clear what his motivation was. At any rate, this is part of what we'll talk about next class.
Okay, yeah.
All right, then. So, all good for today, then?
Yeah, I'm all good here.
Very good. Thanks, Gavin, and we'll make another go of it next week.
All right, cool.
All right, I'll talk to you soon.